The ballroom shimmered with golden light, its crystal chandeliers scattering brightness across polished marble floors. The evening was meant to be the social highlight of the season, a gathering where every influential figure in the city showed up to parade their wealth, beauty, and status. Adrien Morel entered with the confidence of a man who believed the night already belonged to him. His tuxedo was sharp, his shoes gleamed, and on his arm was Serena, the woman who had recently become the center of his world. Whispers erupted almost immediately, rippling through the crowd like an unexpected breeze. People tilted their heads, exchanged glances, and leaned into each other's ears. Adrien pretended not to notice, but inside, he thrived on it. This was exactly what he wanted: attention, shock, envy. For months, society had speculated about his failing marriage. Tonight, he confirmed their suspicions without saying a single word. Serena, glowing in a shimmering silver gown that clung to her like a second skin, pressed closer to him, her smile wide and triumphant. She adored the way women watched with narrowed eyes and the way men followed her every step. "Do you see how they're staring?" she whispered in Adrien's ear, her perfume mingling with the expensive cologne he wore. "They'll get used to it," Adrien replied with a smirk. "After tonight, no one will ever talk about Isabella again. You're the one they'll remember." They walked through the room like royalty, pausing to exchange pleasantries with fellow elites. Some greeted Adrien with polite smiles, others with forced ones, unsure how to acknowledge the new woman at his side. But Serena soaked it all in, convinced she was stepping into a role she had coveted for months. In her mind, Isabella, the quiet, graceful wife who had once been untouchable, was nothing more than a ghost now. "Where is Isabella?" a voice murmured behind them, loud enough to carry. "She won't dare show her face," another responded, almost gleeful. "Not after this." Serena heard it, and the corners of her lips curled higher. The humiliation was delicious. She imagined Isabella hiding away in some dimly lit mansion room, nursing her broken heart, powerless to stop this public unveiling. That thought gave Serena a rush of superiority, the thrill of victory. She leaned her head against Adrien's shoulder as though claiming him for the entire room to see. Adrien, too, basked in the moment. For years, he had lived in Isabella's shadow, her elegance, her intelligence, her ability to command a room with effortless grace. People often said he was fortunate to have married her, that her brilliance elevated his stature. That had stung his pride. But now, with Serena shimmering beside him, he was convinced he had turned the narrative in his favor. Tonight, he was rewriting his story, showing the world that he could discard the woman who once defined him and replace her with someone young, beautiful, and vibrant. They stopped near the center of the hall where the city's most powerful figures gathered. Champagne glasses clinked, laughter echoed, and the string quartet in the corner played a delicate waltz. Serena tilted her head, allowing the diamond earrings Adrien had given her to catch the light. Every gesture was calculated to sparkle, to make the room recognize her as his rightful partner. "Mr. Morel," a businessman greeted warmly, though his eyes flickered uncertainly toward Serena. "What a pleasant surprise." "This is Serena," Adrien announced proudly, placing his hand on the small of her back. "My partner." The word lingered in the air. Some faces stiffened, others tried to mask their shock. Yet Adrien reveled in it, mistaking their discomfort for admiration. Serena's chest swelled with satisfaction. As the night unfolded, they moved from group to group, basking in half-hearted congratulations and the murmur of gossip trailing behind them. Adrien raised his glass, whispering to Serena, "To us. To a new beginning." She clinked her glass against his and smiled, certain the evening would mark the end of Isabella's relevance forever. What neither of them realized was that the night had only just begun, and the spotlight they believed belonged to them was destined to shift in the most unexpected way. The hum of conversation hushed like a sudden breeze passing through a field when the grand doors at the far end of the ballroom opened again. Every head turned in unison. For a heartbeat, silence pressed down on the glittering hall, broken only by the soft notes of the quartet that faltered as the musicians, too, looked toward the entrance. There she was, Isabella. She didn't rush, didn't stumble, didn't even acknowledge the sea of stunned faces staring at her. She walked with calm assurance, each step deliberate, her gown flowing like liquid midnight. The deep sapphire fabric shimmered under the chandelier's light, its elegance understated yet far more captivating than the sequins and crystals that littered the room. A diamond necklace, simple but commanding, rested at her collarbone, catching glimmers of light with every turn of her head. Gasps filled the room. Some mouths fell open. Others whispered feverishly to their neighbors, unable to contain their astonishment. Isabella had not only arrived, she had arrived as though she had never been the betrayed wife but the queen returning to her rightful throne. Adrian's glass slipped slightly in his hand, champagne sloshing over the rim. Serena, who had been laughing moments earlier, felt her throat tighten. She reached instinctively for Adrian's arm, but his eyes were locked on Isabella. She's here, Serena muttered, her voice sharp with disbelief. Adrian didn't answer. His jaw clenched, his breath caught in his chest. He had expected her to cower, to avoid the humiliation of confronting him in public. Yet here she was, walking straight into the fire with a smile that was calm, confident, almost amused. Isabella, a woman called out, rushing forward. Soon others followed, swarming her with greetings, praises, and relief. The crowd parted for her like a tide shifting to make way for the moon's pull. Laughter bubbled around her, cameras flashed, and compliments poured forth. "You look radiant, so glad you came, we've missed you at these gatherings. Always a vision, Isabella. Always." She accepted it all with grace, her smile never faltering, her voice soft but magnetic. Every word she spoke seemed to float above the room, commanding attention. Without effort, without even trying, she had become the focal point. Serena's painted smile wavered. Her gown, though dazzling, suddenly felt gaudy compared to Isabella's timeless elegance. The attention that had fed her minutes ago had vanished, replaced by pointed glances that skipped over her as if she were invisible. She tugged slightly on Adrian's sleeve, desperate for reassurance. "They're all over her," Serena whispered. "Why are they all?" "Be quiet," Adrian snapped under his breath, his voice tight with irritation. He wanted to approach Isabella, to regain some control, but the crowd enveloping her was impenetrable. She laughed lightly at a remark from one of the city's most influential investors, her hand resting briefly on his arm in an effortless display of familiarity. That single gesture twisted in Adrian's gut. Those were his contacts, his allies, yet they now clustered around her like moths to flame. Isabella's eyes flickered across the room, finally landing on Adrian and Serena. For the briefest second, her gaze sharpened, acknowledging them with a small nod, neither hostile nor submissive. Then, just as quickly, she turned back to the group around her, dismissing them from her attention. The slight was subtle, but it was devastating. "She's mocking us," Serena hissed, though her voice trembled. "No," Adrian muttered, though he wasn't sure whom he was trying to convince, Serena or himself. "She won't outshine me tonight." But even as he said it, the truth was undeniable. The spotlight he had craved, the whispers he had hoped would revolve around his daring entrance with a new lover, had shifted entirely. Every camera flashed toward Isabella. Every conversation bent back to her. The scandal that should have defined her was forgotten, replaced by admiration and intrigue. The quartet regained its rhythm, playing louder now as though in celebration of her presence. Isabella allowed herself a soft smile, the kind that spoke of triumph without boasting. She hadn't needed to raise her voice, to throw accusations, or to compete. Simply by walking into the room, she had reclaimed everything Adrian thought he had taken away. And Serena, suddenly invisible despite all her glittering jewels, felt the first sting of something she had not anticipated: irrelevance. Adrian finally could not stand it anymore. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the way every important figure in the room seemed to gravitate toward Isabella like planets pulled by a sun, each moment stoked the fire in his chest. He straightened his tuxedo, tightened his grip on Serena's hand, and marched toward the circle that surrounded his wife. The group noticed him immediately, and a hush fell as he cut through the crowd. Isabella looked up just as Adrian stopped before her, Serena still clinging to his arm. For a moment, it was as though the entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for the scene that was about to unfold. "Isabella," Adrian said with forced composure, his smile thin and sharp. "I didn't expect you here tonight." Her eyes met his calmly, unflinching. "Why wouldn't I be here, Adrian? This event has always been part of our calendar." Her voice was smooth, confident, not a trace of bitterness. Serena stepped forward, eager to insert herself into the moment. Perhaps you didn't hear, Isabella. Things have changed. Adrian and I are standing in a room that doesn't revolve around you, Isabella cut in, her tone cool but not cruel. The crowd reacted with a collective murmur, some covering smiles at the sting of her remark. Adrian's jaw tightened. He hated the way she could so easily disarm any situation with a few words. He needed to strike back, to reassert control. "Allow me to introduce Serena," he said loudly, raising his voice for the nearby guests to hear. "She's my new partner, the woman who will stand by my side now." The words hung heavy in the air, deliberate and cutting. Adrian expected Isabella to flinch, to falter under the weight of public humiliation. Serena lifted her chin, waiting for the gasp, the crack in Isabella's composure. But it never came. Isabella's expression remained serene, almost amused. She tilted her head slightly, her diamond earrings catching the light as she looked at Adrian. "Partner," she echoed softly, as though testing the word. "That's an interesting choice." Adrian frowned. "What do you mean?" She took a step closer, her presence commanding without effort. "I suppose you haven't been paying attention while you've been distracted." Her voice carried easily through the crowd, who now leaned in, hungry for every word. "You see, Adrian, while you were busy parading Serena around, I was finalizing a rather important deal." A ripple of curiosity passed through the room. Isabella allowed the silence to build before delivering the blow. "I am now the majority shareholder in Morel Enterprises." The words struck like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted. People glanced at one another, eyes wide with shock, whispers racing like wildfire. Cameras flashed as though instinctively capturing the moment history shifted. Adrian's face drained of color. "That's impossible," he stammered. "I control the board." "Not anymore," Isabella interrupted, her smile calm and devastating. "I secured the shares from investors you neglected while chasing your personal distractions. They were more than happy to trust me with their interests. After all, stability is far more appealing than scandal." Serena's hand slipped slightly from Adrian's arm, her confidence faltering. She looked around, realizing the stares directed at her were no longer admiring but pitying, even mocking. The guests burst into conversation, some congratulating Isabella outright, others shaking their heads at Adrian's carelessness. "Brilliant move," one whispered. She outplayed him completely. Adrian tried to speak, but his words tangled in his throat. He had envisioned this evening as his triumph, his public liberation from Isabella. Instead, he stood exposed, stripped of power, while his wife, not his lover, was hailed as the victor. Isabella leaned closer, her voice low enough for only Adrian and Serena to hear. "You thought tonight would destroy me. But you should know by now, Adrian, I never step into a room without making sure I own it first." With that, she stepped back into the crowd, who welcomed her with admiration and applause. Adrian remained frozen, Serena clutching his arm but shrinking beside him, both swallowed by the shadow Isabella cast with nothing more than her poise and foresight. For the first time in his life, Adrian realized the spotlight had not just shifted, it had been claimed, and it no longer belonged to him. The ballroom no longer felt like Adrian's stage, it had transformed into Isabella's kingdom. Everywhere she moved, the crowd followed, their conversations orbiting her with effortless magnetism. Cameras flashed with relentless hunger, capturing her calm smile, her poised gestures, the elegance that seemed untouchable. Reporters scribbled notes, investors lined up to shake her hand, and old friends pressed in close as though they had always known she would rise above scandal. Adrian stood off to the side, his glass untouched, Serena still hanging onto his arm though her posture was stiff and brittle. The attention she had craved all evening had evaporated like smoke. Now, even her sparkling gown seemed to scream desperation rather than glamour. She tried to tug Adrian closer to the circle of light where Isabella shone, but he wouldn't move. His face was pale, his pride shattered, his thoughts a mess of disbelief. How had this happened? He had walked in expecting whispers of admiration, pity for Isabella, validation of his bold choice. Instead, Isabella had turned his carefully orchestrated performance into his downfall. The sting of betrayal burned deeper now that it came from the very woman he had tried to discard. "Adrian," Serena muttered, her voice sharp with panic, "say something. Do something. They're all looking at her like she's untouchable." But he couldn't. His tongue felt heavy, his chest tight. He had built his life on control, and Isabella had shattered it with a single revelation. Meanwhile, Isabella remained serene. She moved through the room with the grace of someone who understood her worth did not depend on anyone's approval. Her laughter was genuine, her conversations rich with wit. When a young entrepreneur asked her for advice, she leaned in and gave him her full attention, making him glow as though he'd been knighted. When a seasoned investor praised her boldness, she accepted it with modesty, shifting the credit toward collaboration rather than claiming it all herself. That balance of strength and humility drew people even closer. Finally, the host of the evening, a distinguished woman in pearls, raised her glass and called for attention. The chatter died down instantly. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said warmly, her eyes resting on Isabella, "tonight was meant to celebrate unity and achievement. And I believe we have just witnessed a stunning example of both." She lifted her glass toward Isabella. To Isabella Morel, for her grace, her vision, and her extraordinary strength. The room erupted into applause. Glasses clinked. Cheers rang out. Isabella smiled, bowing her head slightly in gratitude. She did not gloat, did not glance toward Adrian, did not seek to rub salt in the wound. She simply accepted the honor as though it had always belonged to her. Serena's nails dug into Adrian's arm. "They're toasting her, your wife. They're supposed to be toasting us." Adrian pulled free, his voice low and bitter. "They never were ours to claim. She's taken everything." Isabella raised her glass, her eyes sweeping the room. When they briefly met Adrian's, she held his gaze, not with anger or scorn, but with quiet finality. "To new beginnings," she said clearly, her voice carrying over the crowd. "To new beginnings." The guests echoed, their voices full of admiration. That was the last straw. Adrian felt the ground beneath him tilt, the weight of his defeat pressing hard against his chest. Serena tried to lead him back into the crowd, but no one turned to acknowledge them. They were shadows now, whispers of scandal rather than figures of influence. Isabella, on the other hand, had claimed the very thing Adrian had wanted most: relevance, power, admiration. And she had done it not by tearing him down but by standing tall on her own merits. As the night wound down, she thanked the host, exchanged parting words with her admirers, and gracefully made her exit. The crowd parted for her once more, offering smiles, nods, and whispered praises as she passed. The doors closed behind her, leaving the faint echo of her heels on marble. Adrian and Serena stood in the aftermath, ignored, their earlier triumph forgotten. The truth was undeniable. Isabella had taken not just the spotlight, but the story itself. She had rewritten it, leaving them stranded in the shadows of her brilliance. And as the last of the applause faded, Adrian realized something even harsher than defeat: he had never truly known the strength of the woman he had betrayed.